So I trust the mic is adjusted. You've been through that, been there, done that. Good. It's great to be back in New York on a spring evening. I can hardly restrain myself to pour into the matter at hand. However, before I do, I want to thank JP for that lengthy disclaimer and introduction. Now you know where he stands, and I think I know where I stand. The occasion for being here, if there needs to be an occasion, is that The Invisible Landscape is finally out in a new edition. It hasn't been available since 1975, and somebody said to me, you know, it's really good that The Invisible Landscape came out last because you actually sort of went downhill from there, which I sort of agree. I think it's the best piece. It's also the least compromising. It's not something you can shout about from 4 feet behind the footlights. It's more the brothers McKenna's collective stab at immortality. Anyway, it's available. I think it's a very interesting book. I hope you'll read it. It's the companion volume to True Hallucinations, which has been out in hardback for a year, but is now also out in paper. So much for the necessary self-promotion. Okay, this is called either Vertigo at History's Edge or End. I'm not sure which, because I hurried past the poster this morning when I wrote down the title. My notion with this lecture is to talk about, is there any reason why smart people should hope? In other words, can one combine intelligence with hope and not betray one or the other? Is the only reasonable position of intellectuals and people steeped in Western tradition and history one of total hand-wringing, head-scratching despair? This is the official position of the culture, as a matter of fact. Hope is very unsheathed, or it was until recently. There is now, I think, a turning of the corner on this issue in the culture. First of all, simply because despair has been done very well by a number of people. The French got there first. Nobody is going to beat them at that game. And we've been at it since 1950. And I think the various positions have now been run through. So is there a reasonable basis for hope? And how deeply do we have to reconstruct the premises of our worldview in order to legitimately believe in the human enterprise, ourselves, and each other? Well, the answer is you've got to go deep. We've been on a bummer for a long time. Western civilization enshrines as its central mystery the law of thermodynamic entropy, which is a huge bring down. It basically says everything falls apart. Everything dissipates into less structure, less order. Everything is fleeting. And from materialism, we've learned to accept the idea that death is the yawning grave, your compost, that's it. A series of very, quote-unquote, existential presumptions have been built in to Western civilization over the past 300 or 400 years with greater and greater ferocity. And this hopelessness is a concomitant to the rise of hierarchical managerial structures in Western society. In other words, a precondition for hierarchical management of society is a docile, confused, disheartened population, stabilized in an economic system that places a premium on low awareness, repetitious, uncreative lives. And this is the kind of situation in which many, many people, more and more people, find themselves. So because I have an innate intuition that the universe is a more positive enterprise than that, and because I think a fair examination of nature would support this anti-existential position, I sort of wanted to talk about this evening and show how some of the things in my shtick, which are most misunderstood and most misrepresented, are in fact in orbit around this attempt to empower optimism in a domain of believability. I mean, it's easy to be an optimist if you're a nitwit, but to be an optimist and be cool, this is the challenge. It's not easy. I think that our worldview has overlooked two fundamental facts about the nature of reality. And the absence of these two fundamental facts in our models of how the universe works is what has given us such a downward trajectory into factionalism, existential despair, a broken connection to nature and in some cases to each other. Two fundamental things were overlooked, and I want to discuss them and then show how the recovery of these things feeds in to a legitimate optimism. Okay, the first thing that science overlooked, and by science I mean the entire Western value package, the science, the politics, the religion, the aesthetics, because it is all derivative of Renaissance science and transformed classical values. What was overlooked was what I call the conservation of novelty. Now, what I mean by this is something very easy for you to convince yourself is happening. The conservation of novelty is simply that over time, the universe has become more complicated. New levels of complexity become the foundations for yet deeper levels of complexity. And this phenomenon of the production and conservation of what I call novelty is not something which goes on only in the biological domain, or only in the cultural domain, or only in the domain of physics. It is a trans-categorical impulse in reality, meaning it's everywhere, everywhere. The universe was born in a state of great simplicity. There were no atoms, there were no molecules, there were no stars. There was only a plasmic ocean of energy. The physics for describing this were very simple. As time passed, you could almost imagine complexity crystallizing out of a universe that cools. As it cools, new properties emerge. What David Bohm called emergent properties come out of the universal mix. Atomic systems form. This creates an entirely new domain of matter, different from the plasma that preceded it. As the universe cools, matter aggregates into stars. Stars cook out heavier elements, among them carbon. Carbon sets the stage for four-valent complex polymer chemistry that sets the stage for life. Simple life sets the stage for complex life. Complex life sets the stage for multicellular advanced animals, land animals, so forth and so on. You see what the process is here. It's that each emergent property becomes a building block for a new set of phenomena. The concrescence of atomic systems allows the physical world. The generation of carbon chemistry allows the organic world. The complexification of advanced animals allows the conscious world of human culture and civilization. Now, interesting to note about this is it's fairly obvious. I don't think we have to beat each other over the head with it. It's pretty clear that it's true and that it's happening. Yet science has never joined us in this perception of the obvious. Science believes in evolution, but in biological systems, but defines it as a completely non-progressive process where random mutation meets natural selection, and out of this comes an ever differentiating set of forms. But an orthodox evolutionary biologist will be quick to tell you, you mustn't make the intellectual error of thinking of this as progress or advance or movement toward a goal. These are all teleological ideas that science expunged from its evolutionary theory. So biological process is not seen as progressive. And yet, what I'm saying to you this evening is that not only is biology progressive, but it emerges out of an antecedent progressive process, the evolution of physical matter and the physical universe of stars and so forth, and it anticipates a deeper advance into progressive integration in the form of culture, language, human beings, the creation of material culture, the elaboration of the arts and sciences, so forth and so on. Okay, that's I think, fairly obvious. And yet science, by denying it, gives us no arrow of purpose in the felt world of human existence. When you go to the universities and you ask what is history, you will be told it's a trendlessly fluctuating process. Well, this is fascinating. If it's a trendlessly fluctuating process, it is the only process ever observed to behave in that fashion. Processes, by their very nature, have an innate predictability. So that's the first thing that I think science and the worldview derivative of it has overlooked, that from the very birth of the universe, there was a progressive advance into complexity that built on previously achieved levels and adumbrated those levels, brought them to still a deeper expression of novelty and complexification until we arrive at this moment in this city. And I submit to you, this is the most complex moment in the most complex place in the universe to date, because we have the physical world, the natural world, your basic human world, your basic post-industrial human world, the world of electronic human integration, the world of post-modernity. We are the inheritors of all the complexity that preceded us. Okay, So then that brings me to the second point, empowering optimism of a fairly radical sort. And again, I appeal to your observational intelligence. Nothing is going to be asserted that runs counter to intuition, but what is asserted runs counter to the description of reality that we're getting from science. The second point relates to the first. It is this: not only has novelty conserved itself and built on what has been achieved in the past to move toward the future, but, and of the 2 points, this is the more important, each stage of advancement into novelty, into complexity, into concrescence, has proceeded more quickly than the phase which preceded it. The universe is in a state of asymptotic acceleration of some sort. And this has been completely denied by science. I mean, science says that everything interesting happened at the beginning of the birth of the universe. In a few very short eras, a number of physical states came and went. A number of sets of physical laws superseded each other. But after a few minutes, the universe settled in to a steady cooling along the lines which we see around us. And then science says that at some unimaginably distant point in the future, the stars will burn out, entropic heat death will set in, all structure will dissipate, and the whole thing will sort of evaporate away like an Alka-Seltzer tablet. To maintain that kind of an entropic view of the universe, you have to completely ignore the importance of biology. Now, it so happens that we live around a very stable star that probably has a lifespan of 7 or 8 billion years. But this has given us a false sense of the stability and the enduringness of matter. The lives of most stars are on the order of 500 million to 1 billion years. Life has been active on this small planet for 1.5 billion years. As a process with inert tenacity, life is as persistent as the stars themselves. In fact, more so. Now, we know that stars are simply large nuclear furnaces which eventually use up all their fuel and run down. But what life is, we're not at all sure. Hardly to speak of intelligence. Life and intelligence are the wild cards in the universal deck. We now aspire to a planetary civilization, to the electronic storage of information for eons, and we have only been at this global cultural game for about 50 years. It's very clear, to me at least, that life is a process as important in shaping the eventual destiny of the universe as physics or chemistry, and that intelligence also plays a role there. Well, if you have a universe that is building on achieved novelty and building faster and faster, then you have a universe which is consuming its share of time, if you will. A universe which is building toward its conclusive denouement much faster than the entities, the beings embedded in it might suppose. And I said that in order to hope, you have to dump the whole scientific view of the universe. you also have to take your own humanness much more seriously. As a way to let us escape from moral obligation to ourselves and each other, science proclaimed the ephemerality of the human experience, that we arose on a minor planet around an uninteresting star in a typical galaxy. We are no more than animals. We will have our moment. We will sputter out. We will leave a greasy trace in the shales, and that will be it. And therefore, talking about higher values, love, ethical obligation, and so forth is thought to be terribly old hat. I take an entirely different view, harking back to the Renaissance humanists with a vengeance. And I think that human beings on this planet and the kind of society that we live in is an enunciation of the approaching ascent into higher levels of novelty. Nothing is unannounced. Nothing comes unexpectedly if you know how to read the signs. And for a very, very long time,